Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those in Western Australia. My name is Heath Bruin. We're going to take a few minutes to introduce ourselves, then we'll kick off with the main part of today's webinar. But firstly, thank you all for dialing in. I really appreciate your time today. To quickly go over agenda for what we're going through today, and then I'll get the presenters to introduce themselves. Essentially, we'll go spend some time at the start looking at the intent and the process, developing the guidelines and how we got here today. And then we'll hand over to Cutler Meurs team there to go through more of a deep dive on the technical settings behind the basic connections and the LV connection guidelines, and look at the differences between the two. Finally, after a period of time, we'll go through just a quick outline of the next steps after today and have time for questions. Presenters wise, Stuart, Tim, Sarnika, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Heath. Stuart Johnston here from Energy Networks Australia. I'm the GM Network Transformation.
Tim Edwards here, Managing Director, Cutler Meurs, and Project Director on this project.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarnika. We're live from Cutler Meurs. I'm a Project Manager on this project.
All right, thank you guys. Ensure that where you are situated today, you're safe in your surroundings. Feel free to leave at any time. I don't know if it's going to be an issue, but just to be sure, don't put this call on hold, as we might hear your on hold call music. Questions-wise, we're going to leave the questions to the end of today's discussion, but please, on the bottom left-hand side of the screen or somewhere on the screen, you should see a chat box available for you to type messages in. Just type your questions clearly and about what particular subject you're after, and we'll address them at the end. If questions seem to be or appear to be addressed as we go, we might skip over them at the end, but feel free to use the chat box. If you have troubles using the system, the Redback support number is there. Please use that. ENA has, at this point, not much control over the process, so feel free to get hold of them if need be. Stuart, I'll hand over to yourself to go through the overview and origin of this work.
Thanks, Heath. First of all, I'd like to reiterate Heath's welcome to everyone on today's call, and thank you all for taking time out to actually listen to this. It's great to see so much interest and support for this project, as it's become apparent through the work we're doing, particularly with Open Energy Networks, that these guidelines are a key enabler for the transition of our energy future in terms of connecting more DER to the system. This first slide is basically around what are the actual DER connection guidelines. These guidelines are a template for networks to try and develop their own guidelines that are nationally consistent, which will be used to provide guidance to customers on the requirements for connecting to the grid. So what we're trying to do is actually set out these series of guidelines at the different levels, so basic, LV, HV, and MV, so that at a national consistent, so that all of our members can then replicate those for themselves, and we actually get a consistent set of guidelines across the country, and also that we actually get consistent language across the country in terms of how we actually deal with these. These guidelines are intended to address some of the current technical requirements as a point in time. So there has been some comments back from stakeholders that they wanted people to see it going further in terms of where the transition was going, but we have to actually develop these to what the current rules are at the moment. However, the whole idea of the frameworks document, which we released earlier this year, is that we've actually got a process that as soon as there is a change to the system, that we can actually quickly update these documents, which will then flow on to the members' guidelines. So we can actually quickly update these, and we actually make sure they're actually keeping up to speed. And I suppose these requirements have shifted to the future to now revisions of these guidelines, which will capture those changes. The other thing is, I suppose, it depends on where this actually came from. So there was some previous work that was actually done by the CEC, the future proofing of the distribution industry, which looked at connection guidelines across the board and did a good comparison, and it identified a lot of issues, as well as the roadmap process. And so both those projects identified that there was an issue of consistency between networks in terms of the technical requirements, the documentation requirements, and the structure of those documents. There was issues around clarity, and so the whole idea is to try and make it more clear in terms of what those actual technical requirements are going to be. We also need to do that in a way that actually strikes a balance between mitigating network risks and network costs, but also efficiency for the stakeholder or the customer, and actually that's going through that connection process. And last but not least, we also want to make sure that some of the past documents that are out there were quite onerous in terms of how they're actually, what they're actually asking and how they were doing it, and quite onerous in terms of the process. The whole idea is to try and limit that as much as possible, and to try and make it a lot easier for people to engage. And last but not least, which we were saying before, is establishing that platform for networks to develop common standards and protocols for future management of active DER. Now, these documents are actually being set out as guidelines, so that does mean that they are voluntary. However, it has been identified through the process, and there's also another reason for that, is that by being a guideline, it means they can actually be more reactive to change. So if you went through a standards process, we'd probably have to go through the standards. Every time we wanted to update that, you have to go through the full standards process to actually get that through, which would mean that the documents would be quite slow in terms of reacting. However, even though they are voluntary because they are a guideline, there is an expectation, and there's been a willingness by the networks that they are all going to be utilising these and actually and taking these on. So this project has actually been driven by the networks who are actually paying for this fully to actually develop these, and so in the realisation that if they don't go down this sort of path and they don't utilise these and they're not effective in driving those desired outcomes, then potentially that the regulators or policymakers could come in and actually either create rules which will actually mean that these will become mandatory, or it could actually turn it into a standards-based option. Now, in terms of the compliance to the actual guidelines, again, it was actually important that we actually identified a way to go about how do we actually measure that, and how do we actually make sure that we do. So even though they are voluntary, we are looking at having a compliance to that. Now, so in doing that, we're actually saying that the distribution network providers must provide their own technical requirements documents which adopt the structure and definitions and technical settings as set out by these guidelines. Now, if the DNSP or the network has to depart from the guideline for any reason, it might be seen that there's some issue with their that makes their network slightly different, or part of their network slightly different, they will be seen as still complying with the guidelines, so long as they actually document why there has been a departure, and that departure is actually there's the reasons for those are actually documented in terms of the national electricity objectives. So they have to actually probably provide a good rationale and explanation on why that's going to be slightly different to the others, so people have a good understanding of what's going on there. However, if there is no difference between everything, then the customers and proponents are likely to expect that the networks will have to comply to the standard template. In terms of how we're going to ensure that those guidelines are actually being taken on by our members and they're actually adhering to that, we are looking at doing a regular evaluations of the NSP to actually determine the level of compliance and whether the desired outcomes have been achieved both for the NSP and the proponents. So we're looking at doing this once it actually gets in place and they get going on a 2-yearly basis. But however, we'll actually do the first review after 6 months after the publication of the first of the technical guidelines to see do they need tweaking straight up, so we don't wait that period of the 2 years. In terms of the process to where we've got to now, there has been a lot of stakeholder engagement through this whole process. Obviously, we did a lot of work in terms of stakeholder engagement when we were actually setting up the frameworks and principles guideline. We went out and obviously had national webinars on that, and then we went and met and talked with various stakeholders around that. And then secondly, once we then started the technical guidelines, we have gone through even more detailed stakeholder engagement. So we have been meeting quite heavily with all of the DNSPs. So we actually had workshops with every single individual DNSP. We've had workshops with the Clean Energy Council, and then we've also had talks and engagement with both AEMO and the AEMC to talk through some of their requirements for this document as well. We've also tried to provide updates through to into the wider sphere of stakeholders through public webinars. And if people want to see some of the draft revision process, I won't go through all the quarterly briefings. We don't need to go. So from all of that, we actually developed a set of principles in developing these technical requirements. Goes back to where those are the issues we actually identified and things which were some of the drivers for why they're actually set up. So the first one is obviously to deliver that consistency, improve that clarity and transparency, and balancing network risk with connection efficiency. So, and the last but not least, I suppose, is around that promoting innovation. So the whole idea is if things change, we can actually use it. These documents can actually be innovative. They can actually be changed. They can be updated and actually hopefully to drive some of the innovation that we required to actually integrate more DER into the system going forward. That sort of gives you a very brief overview of sort of what happened, what we've done, and where we came from, and why we've actually set these things up. Would be very happy to explore some of those issues, particularly around the compliance and how we actually update that later on through the question process if needed. But now I'm going to hand over to Tim Edwards and Sanika to take us through some of the technical requirements and technical issues around the two guidelines in question today.
Thank you, Stuart, and just reiterating our welcome and our thanks to everyone who's joined. Very pertinent to note at this point that there's quite a few people on the call, so exciting to see that. From that perspective, given the breadth of the audience that we've got on the webinar, from DNSPs to government representatives to industry bodies to proponents, etc., we've aimed to pitch this at a level in terms of the slide deck and what you're about to receive in terms of information, such that it's comprehensive enough to do justice to the actual guidelines, but at the same time remain at a high enough level to be able to engage as broadly as possible with the content that we've got. And so from that perspective, we ask you to bear with us as we work through the meat of the slide deck, and we're very interested, as mentioned by Heath, well, Stuart, to continue to engage. And so from that perspective, looking forward to the questions at the end of the presentation. But in introducing Sanika, I'd just like to really reconfirm this sense that both Heath and Stuart put forward around the process being just as important as the content to us. And from that perspective, we've been very pleased, we feel, to have gotten the balance right between process and content throughout. And as such, I'll pass on to Sanika so that we can work through that content, very much expecting that we will require your patience throughout so that we can get through it. But our commitment when we do get through it is to actually respond to as many of the questions that will be coming through, and even look to, if we can, to respond to all of the questions after the webinar where we can't get through to all of them during the session. So it's really an invitation to open this up, but at the same time balance that with getting through the content. So I'll get out of Sanika's way now and hand over to her so she can take you through the details.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Stuart, for the introduction. I'll just dive right in. So with the webinar, we're aiming to cover off a lot of the technical settings that we're presenting within the guidelines for basic and LV connections. So those are the topics there I've listed from 1 to 11, and how we'll sort of a guide for where we're up to in terms of those topics. We'll have this bar along the left-hand side with all the different colours and all the different types of technical settings. So you'll sort of, hopefully it'll help tell you where we're at within the presentation. Okay, so for basic connections, the first technical setting that we're sort of wanting to talk about was subcategories of basic connections, and that's really the intention of the subcategories are to split up the basic connections so that we understand which technical settings apply to each type of subcategory. And in the first instance, so the first one there is for single phase IES systems. We are setting those to 5 kilowatts, and then that can, so either that one, or if you have a single phase IES or IES with storage, so energy storage systems or ESS, then that system capacity can be less than or equal to 10 kilowatts. The second subcategory there is 3-phase connections that are either IES or IES with ESS, with a system capacity of less than or equal to 30 kilowatts. Lastly, we have a non-standard subcategory, and that's really trying to capture connections that don't fit into, single phase and 3-phase connections, and they would capture things like WIR networks, isolated networks, and CBDs. And in the guideline, or through the guideline, we would have the DNSPs define, where those areas are that non-standard connections would apply for. So another aspect of basic connections that we wanted to cover off through the guidelines is generation control, which would apply in the form of an export limit at the metering point, which is required, and then a site generation limit downstream of the metering point, which is a measured site generation limit that would be optional in addition to the export limit. So just looking into the export limits a little bit further, we've just defined what the export limits are per subcategory that we talked about in the previous slide. So we've got, for the single phase IES 5 kilowatts, we're able to export 5 kilowatts, and that's a soft export limit as per 4777's definition. And then if you have a single phase IES or IES with ESS, it's an export limit of 5 kilowatts. It's also actually a better way to describe the export limits is 5 kilowatts per phase, except for non-standard connections where we where the DNSP would be required to set it out up front in the guidelines. And similarly with site generation limits, those limits would also be around 5 kilowatts per phase, with the exception of non-standard connections, which would be set out upfront in the guidelines. For protection settings, where really we know that 4777 covers off the systems up to 200 kilowatts. So in this basic guideline, it's covering from 0 to 30 kilowatts. So we're really relying on protection requirements that come through 4777, particularly for anti-islanding protection, as well as passive and active, and then central protection where it's required, and also interlocking requirements for multiple single phase inverters connected to to the grid. And similar to protection, earthing requirements also come from 4777 and also from AS 3000. For basic connections, for jurisdictions that are subject to Chapter 7 of the NER, there are no metering requirements for the moment. So any jurisdictions that fall outside of that, that aren't subject to Chapter 7 of the NER may include metering requirements in their guidelines. So power quality also comes from the requirements of 4777 for inverter energy systems, and that is to require volt watt and volt bar response modes being available in inverters, and then either setting those volt watt and volt bar response modes or setting fixed power mode with or without volt bar response modes. And those settings are defined by the DNSPs. There are no mandatory requirements for communication systems at the moment, other than the demand response trip function through 4777. But where there are communications requirements, we've sort of required that the DNSPs recommend those requirements to proponents that they should adopt in order for participation in dynamic management through the network. And then there may be specific requirements for non-standard connections as well, which will be set out in the DNSP's technical requirements document. So data and information. So yeah, I think Stuart might have mentioned there's a lot of things happening at the moment with OEN and also AEMO's DER register development, and that which is going to be finalised at the end of 2019. So through the guidelines, we just aim to incorporate the static data that will be required for that purpose for DNSP stores, and we've just listed some of those there in draft format on the slide, though they'll be finalised later next year. There are some dynamic data requirements that may be specified where communication systems are in place, and we might see those be utilised a little bit more once the OEN is finalised and drive the requirements for dynamic management. So with cybersecurity, where there are no communication systems in place, there aren't any cybersecurity requirements. But where there are, so we've set out some of those requirements there, ensuring that devices, monitoring and communication devices are in lockable enclosures, protection and control from network systems, so things like firewalls are in place, privilege settings and password protection, as well as making sure access is only to what's required to monitor the generating unit. There are no technical studies required by proponents to connect to the network, but in saying that, the guidelines do give the DNSPs the flexibility to carry out those technical studies if they want to at their own cost, but it shouldn't affect the technical requirements that are imposed for basic connections. Testing and commissioning requirements are as per 4777 and 5033, and also the equipment manufacturer specifications, so there's no additional requirements there. And operation and maintenance. What we've required through the guidelines is to ensure that the IES and ESS are operated and maintained to ensure compliance with the connection agreement that they have with the DNSP, as well as legislation, codes and other regulatory instruments. Something that DNSPs will be able to do is inspect the IES and ESS at any time at their own cost. And there are some general expectations that the electrical installation is safe, that a qualified electrician carries out all the work that's electrical in nature, and that there's a COC for every change or installation that's made, and any changes to the system capacity or settings should have DNSP approval prior to carrying those out. So those were largely all the technical settings for basic connections. I'll dive into the LV connections now. So following the similar format, subcategories, we've defined the first one to be non-basic IES or IES with ESS greater than 30 kilowatts and less than or equal to 200 kilowatts. So that's also still covered under 4777. And that's further categorized by exporting or non-exporting as well. The second subcategory there is related to non-basic IES or IES with ESS greater than 200 kilowatts up to the network prescribed LV maximum system capacity. And that's also further categorized by exporting or non-exporting systems. And then lastly, there's a category for non-inverter energy systems, which would be synchronous or asynchronous systems that are greater than 0 kilowatts and then up to the network prescribed LV maximum, also further subcategorized by exporting and non-exporting. So where proponents envision that they would be connecting close to the LV network maximum, they would, we'd suggest that they talk to the DNSP just to make sure that the LV connection is still right for them. In terms of generation control, it is the same concept as what we talked about in the basic. So it will apply in terms of export limit at the metering point or downstream of the metering point. So not all. It's definitely required for export limits. And the site generation limit is an optional additional requirement that would be set by the DNSP downstream of the metering point. So export limits for LV connections are determined on a case-by-case basis at the time of the application. So there would also be a soft limit. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but the soft limit means that the inverter would be ramping down rather than tripping off, which would be a hard limit. Essentially, the export limit would be calculated with consideration to power quality, asset ratings, and then penetration of to the network. Yeah. So the guidelines do sort of give signal that that an indicative estimate of the export limit can be provided at the inquiry stage. And where the proponent wants a higher export limit, and if DNSPs are able to provide an augmentation cost of the alternative export amount. And site generation limits that are set may be required, as I mentioned before, and they're also determined at the time of application, and there are a number of factors to consider for those as well, for setting those. So the next technical setting we're looking at is protection. So where it's appropriate, they should be aligned with 4777.1 and 0.2, and where they're not, as per the principles of those standards or premises of those standards. And inverter integrated protection requirements would include anti-islanding, and also the 4777 also has a lot of information relating to central protection where it's required to include grid reverse power, generator, circuit phase balance protection, overcurrent facility fault, grid fault and earth fault protection, as well as anti-islanding, as I mentioned before, and potentially also inter-tripping protection. So as a part of LV connections, so we should also mention interlocking requirements as well as specific requirements for non-IES, which may not be covered under 4777. The network connection and isolation requirements will be as per 4777 and AS 3000 as well as the minimum. And just to further clarify, so mechanical isolation would be as per AS 3000, and there's some detail provided there. Grid protection devices shall have certified compliance with 4777, and then making sure that IES and IES with IES, sorry, ESS would be connected to the electrical installation on the grid side of RCDs, and then also specifying requirements for multi-mode IES as well. So LV connections earthing requirements for IES would be as per AS 3000, 4777, or with references to the premises of that standard. And then for non-IES as per AS 3000 and AS 3010 as a minimum, and then for ESS as per 3011. So similar to the basic connections, there are no requirements for metering for jurisdictions under the NER. And then for jurisdictions that are outside of that, they may include metering requirements in this section of the guideline, of their technical requirements document. The power quality requirements for LV connections will be primarily based on 4777 as well for IES, which is volt bar response mode, or fixed power factor mode with volt bar response mode. And then for non-IES, either using fixed power factor mode or voltage control mode. And then just reiterating here that inverters must have both volt bar and volt watt available, and that the settings would be based on what the NSPs recommend. Yep. And with communication systems, there are no mandatory requirements for non-basic connections, but where DNSPs have requirements for communications, they are required to recommend those requirements to proponents, particularly with regards to participation with dynamic management, and that will become more prevalent later on. The second one there is communications requirements for the embedded generating unit subcategory, including IES or ESS, IES or IES with ESS, greater than 200 kilowatts, and that's similar to the non-IES category as well. Actually, they're both identical, where they have no requirements for non-exporting systems, and they have some requirements there for exporting, including continuous monitoring via sort of a range of communication technology options, and then also setting out, who's responsible for setting up and monitoring the communication links, as well as what the interface signal requirements are. So the guideline will speak to that. With regards to the data and information, so this is again really trying to incorporate the AEMO DIR register, or setting it up for when the DIR register will be ready for incorporation, and it sets it up by splitting up between static data and dynamic data, where static data is the data points that we've included there as a draft information about the system that the proponent would need to provide to the DNSP, and dynamic data would be basically specifying requirements for when data would need to be sent to DNSPs or other bodies where communication systems are in place. Similarly, so where there are no communications requirements, there aren't any cybersecurity requirements. So I've just sort of reiterated that there. But where there are communications requirements, The cybersecurity requirements that apply can include things like, I've repeated these before in the basics, so I won't go through them again, but you can read through those later. Okay, so technical studies that we will require for LV connections. That should be completed either by the DNSP or paid for by the proponent or arranged to be completed by the proponent. Will include voltage level, including power factor, power flow, fault level studies, and protection grading studies. And as you can see in the table there, I haven't provided a legend, I should have, but the ticks indicate that they should be required. The test should be required for that particular category. So at the top there we've got IES and non-IES, and then if we just focus on the IES for now, it's split further up into non-basic micro-EG, which is less than or equal to 200 kVA, or greater than 200 kVA, and then that's further subcategorized into exporting and non-exporting, and then that's similarly split up for non-IES. So that should sort of reflect all the subcategories we've talked about before. So yeah, a tick is a required test. A dash is it may be required depending on the system or the network requirements, and then a cross would be not required. So for each technical study that's undertaken by the proponent or required to be undertaken, DNSPs should be able to provide inputs that they need to be provided to them, outputs that they need from the proponent, and then also criteria against which the study should be assessed. And then if the study is undertaken by the DNSP will set out how much time and cost it would take to complete the test or technical study, and then all the outputs that will be provided as well as the criteria again here. So where it fails, where the connection application fails a technical assessment, there should be some alternatives that the DNSP can give the proponent. So that'll be either in the form of alternative sort of solutions to the system design, and I've got there an example of lower export limits or network augmentation, which they'll give an associated cost for that when they recommend that. And so for testing and commissioning, so similarly I've provided a table here again to show all the subcategories and how the requirements apply. So we've got requirements including protection settings, power quality settings, export limits, communication settings, and shutdown procedures. And you can see which ones we've recommended should be required or not required or may be required. So testing and commissioning acceptance. This section is really about making sure that what's being installed and all the settings that have been applied are correct and they're kept and they're maintained to be correct. Sorry, that's actually covered on operations and maintenance, the next slide. But they're making sure that the commissioning is all correct. And one of the requirements through the guidelines that we placed is that the plan should be produced by the proponent and may be required to be signed off by the DNSP. And that's just so that they can run through it and make sure that it all looks fine and give any comments or suggestions for improvement. Another point there is that the acceptance should be signed off by a CPN or RPQ or someone suitably qualified from the DNSP. And where testing and commissioning acceptance is carried out, the DNSP might need to witness that, and that would be at the DNSP's expense. I've provided here some requirements for IES and also for non-IES. That would be something they'd be looking into. Okay, so for operations and maintenance, the guidelines aim to drive that the O&M plans to be produced and the DNSP may require for it to be signed off prior to that connection agreement going ahead. And it recommends that the system should be operated and maintained to make sure that it complies with all of the connection agreement, as well as all the legislation codes and standards. An optional requirement there as well is for O&M reports to be regularly or periodically sent to the DNSP. That's depending on whether the DNSP chooses to require that. And then also the DNSP may inspect the unit at their own cost. So there are some further general expectations for operating and maintaining the system that we've included, and these are maintaining the electrical installation in a safe condition, ensuring that changes are made by qualified personnel, and then also seeking DNSP approval where it's required if any changes are being made to the system. So I think that covers off all of the technical settings. And an additional sort of section I wanted to brief everybody on was also the appendices, which include where DNSPs are deviating from the guidelines. They would include some sort of a summary of what they're deviating from and provide sort of a reason or rationale for that. And then another appendices, also in the appendices would include connection arrangement requirements, so possibly sample SLDs or schematic diagrams, as well as model offers or standing offer agreements or equivalent. That would be, I think, it would prove to really help proponents find those documents in an easy way. Okay, so hand over back to Stuart or Heath.
Yeah, sure, I'll take the lead. Thanks, Danica. Yeah, I'll try and rip through these last few slides, then we'll go to questions. So next steps, as written up there, really trying to finish these basic LV guidelines by Christmas. We've got a meeting or two lined up with key stakeholders prior to then. We also have the current sort of final draft out for consultation with the DNSPs. Those on the call, you're able to also email me, which I'll give details later, and access a draft if you like a draft to have a look at and provide some comment on yourself. But yeah, really try to wrap it up in the Christmas. It may not be released until after Christmas, noting that most people are away over that period, so it may actually not release it until January, but we'll see how we go. The MV and HV guidelines work will then kick off after the break, and we're about 6 months time frame to complete those. We'll go through a similar process, engagement, combination webinars, face-to-face meetings, workshops, etc. My hope is it'll go a bit smoother. Not the same as smooth, but certainly we'll learn from our work so far on these guidelines. After that, as indicated previously, we do have immediately after basically finishing the MV and HV documents, we'll then work straight on to reviewing the basic and LV implementation and how that's travelling 6 months after finishing those. As I've noted there, my email address is there. If you'd like a copy of the draft, or perhaps a copy of these slides, please email me that address. We do have quite a short time frame, but there is still time to provide comment on that draft version. If you'd like a copy, just send an email to me today or tomorrow would be great. Guys, I might go back through the questions now. I'll start from the top, and I might read them out and hand them to people, or I guess Danica, Tim, and Stuart, you could sort of put your hand up and answer them as we go.
Yeah, just while you're doing that, I'm just going to say I'd also like to just put out an acknowledgement for the work that Melanie Corner has done in the work to date as well. So she's been a great part of the project up to this stage, and she's just gone off on maternity leave. So I just wanted to acknowledge the work she's done.
Thanks, Stuart. We're in touch with Melanie continually. She has sent some pictures of the newborn. Everyone is healthy. and taken care of. And yes, looking forward to her joining. I think in her words, she thinks she'll get rather bored rather quickly, and we'll be looking forward to perhaps before the 6 months period to getting back into work. So by the time the HVMV guidelines are being developed, she could very well refeature as part of what we're working through. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Heath, just in terms of questions, I think because we're capturing them as they're coming up as well, there's a few themes, I guess, that in some ways could be collated. So if you're happy for us to sort of work through responding to the themes, then we might find, and I'm very pleased at how we're going, because though the webinar so far has captured a sense of content that may have been seen as too heavy or technical by some people on the call, by others on the call not technical enough, there's at least an opportunity for a good half an hour plus to work through questions to increase awareness around these guidelines. From that perspective, we've got a good amount of time to work through these themes and responses. But I think one
to go with that, we've got these, we're actually recording those questions as well. So yes, we'll go through and actually answer them here as much as possible. But also, if we run out of time, we can actually put those up on our website, and we can actually group those. And if wanted to, we can actually put responses to each of those up on our website at a later date.
Absolutely, and it really is. Yeah, from a perspective of being exhaustive and comprehensive, we really do aim to achieve that. So thanks for that, Stuart and Heath. I think one question that's come up that I picked up on, and I appreciate the question being asked, is the extent to which there's a lot of heavy referencing of standards, particularly around 4777. And so there's an underlying question there around, so what is it about these guidelines doing something different if there's a lot of referencing to other standards? And perhaps if we go to the objectives slide, sure. There is a strong sense of creating a baseline that responds to these objectives that we're about to put up on the screen. And they really have to do with clarity, consistency, and balancing this sense of being able to protect networks against risks, but by the same token, look at the efficiency of uptake of DIR as a result of having higher penetration levels. And so draw everyone's attention to that screen, because it could be interpreted very much so that AS4777 had a core element of being able to guide the manufacturer and the specific elements of what needs to be catered for within solar PV installations and within the cells themselves. But that in and of itself is one part of the clarity and consistency element that's being covered off through these guidelines. The other element is this consistency nationally that comes from the technical requirements being applied. So a lot of what's being referenced in other standards is so that there isn't a sense of trying to recreate the wheel, but at the same time, there is a strong sense of trying to remain consistent when 4777 or other standards can be open to different interpretations or different applications. So we've looked to in these guidelines to get quite particular around how the interpretation should be adopted within the guidelines, and then set the tone for how distribution network service providers then create their own network standards to adhere to these guidelines. So I wanted to pick that one up first on the basis that we're very conscious of not recreating the wheel, but creating a consistency across different DNSPs and across different networks. Just to look into sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Tim, are you looking at then
What's that?
scroll through the rest of these questions?
Yeah.
Well then, Tim, do you want to speak to the rest of the questions?
Yeah, we're just working through trying to group some of these.
I think there's a couple of questions there I can see around the DER register. Just want to reiterate that we're working closely with AEMO on the DER register and placing aligning requirements between these documents.
Yeah, so part of the engagement today has involved quite a heavy emphasis on trying to align the concept of a DER register that's being progressed by AEMO with what might be captured within these guidelines. And so there are a couple of questions on that. Thanks for that, Ethan. The idea there in terms of keeping it simple with the response is we're really looking for alignment with and to support AEMO's process by remaining in touch and making sure that there isn't a set of different requirements that may emerge from what AEMO is going to release. The release date for those, Steve or Stuart, for the DER register?
That's next year.
Yeah, and so in a lot of ways, it's looking to preempt that by working with AEMO. But for those questions that are coming through around avoiding any issues that come with what the standard data requirements are, particularly where there's a central resource for capturing those, and that would be AEMO in this instance, and giving the questioner there some comfort that there's a lot of work with AEMO to create alignment between what they're going to produce next year.
Yeah, I'd agree. The issue we probably want to highlight is that these guidelines are seen as the mechanism for capturing the data for the DER register going forward, and that's probably the key message we've been and think we've been working on with AEMO around. We should recognise that the first iteration of these will go out before their guideline comes out, but the reason why we've been engaging with them is to try and capture as much as possible of their thinking within this first iteration, and then once their new guideline comes out around what's required for the register, we'll update these documents to make sure that those if there's anything extra that needs to go in, it will go into the national guidelines as well.
Yeah. Some questions around KVA and kilowatt, and at times they're used interchangeably, but for the questioner there, the response is the intention of the final set of guidelines to be in KVA to align with 4777. Again, I appreciate that these are technical questions, so happy to respond and work through them. Hope it's of broader interest, but in terms of small rotating machines, we have catered for those in the LV guidelines in particular. And so where we're looking at non-IES, for there to be a consistency around basically the elements of small wind or diesel that may be connected to the LV network. There is a section within the final guideline that's going to create some guidance for the industry on that. Sorry, Stuart, go ahead. You're about to mention something.
Oh no, don't worry. You covered that. That's okay.
At this stage, we're getting to most of the questions being answered. There's a team in the background trying to collate a lot of things so that we can gather themes and respond to them.
There is a question around the whole volt watt, volt var requirements, Tim. So did you want to go through that process. They've just asked for clarification.
Sure. So a lot of what's being worked through in terms of what involves VAR and both response modes being enabled. The thinking there is with the guidance provided in 4777, not both modes are necessarily enabled, and what we're looking for, and this aligns with the objective of balancing network risk against maximum uptake of DER, is to have both those modes available so that they could be set as opposed to just one of them. And what that will provide is a sense of being able to create more control and more ability for DER to both increase in terms of penetration while having an additional metric or parameter to be able to control any disturbances that go outside of the legislated limit. There is a question that also touches on international standards and the extent to which we've engaged outside of Australia and the feature of consumers' long-term interests. So the short answer there is yes, and there have been a few delegations around IEEE and other non-Australian or ASNZ standards that we've engaged with through workshops and in learning from recent events in the US in particular. How the balance of making sure that the guidelines are responding to risks, but also opportunities of their uptake are being featured from what we're learning overseas. It's pertinent to note, though, that around that, while there is a sense of observing what's happening internationally, particularly in the US and Europe, we're very conscious of the preset and the influence of national standards on the current state of the technical requirements more broadly. And so in an effort to ensure that we're not resetting the entire requirement for technical settings, there's been a closer adherence to Australian standards while being conscious of what needs to specifically change, such as those two VAR response modes being made available to enable further control and ability of the uptake to be progressed. There's a question that's broadly referencing as well competition policy and implications of recommending technical specifications. So we have actually engaged with the rule maker as we were developing these guidelines, and we're very conscious of the implications around competition and the requirement to ensure that where there are settings that are being put forward, they're in line very directly with the rules that are being set around network security and reliability, and then the ability to ensure that the protection that comes with having to ensure that the security and reliability requirement is as far as the settings go, as opposed to going further into trying to assume anything around competition which may be adverse. So they are intentionally technically based standards, and the technical requirements look at those objectives quite seriously around balancing network risk. And when we try to translate network risk into a technical setting, it's about ensuring security and reliability of supply is maintained as opposed to overreaching any further around competition.
Just going back to the standards component, Patricia just came up with another question around the transition to the transition path for the international community. I suppose what I'd probably raise here is it's probably not the the job of this document to do that, or this piece of work, but there is work we're doing with the Open Energy Networks program and also engagement with Standards Australia around the whole idea around how do we actually adopt, or better adopt or align with international standards. And that's been recognised particularly around things like data protocols, comms protocols, interoperability in particular. The whole idea is how do we actually get alignment, particularly where we've got gaps in standards at the moment. How can we potentially look at what's out there and actually try and align with those? There is a program of work that's separate to that, and if that then happens through those processes, then that would then get reflected back into these documents. So I suppose that's, it's not saying there's a barrier, but the barrier for this document is that we're going with what's existing for the requirements from an Australian perspective at the moment. But as if other pieces of work are working on those to actually try and accelerate our alignment with international standards and requirements, then that will then get back reflected back in these documents. Secondly, I'll just go on in terms of what's going on around the world. There is another project going on in the UK. They actually looked at what we're doing here with the National Guideline for Connection, and they're doing something similar as well. So similar to how they're doing an open energy program for their process, they're also doing something there. And again, we're doing a bit of sharing around in terms of how they're actually going about their process as well. And back to you, Tim.
A question also up here on the installation and the access that's currently provided to installers and ensuring that the integrity of the settings that will be entered within the installation is going to be maintained. So for the questioner there is a provision within the guidelines to ensure that that's tied down and monitored so that there is a sense of a check on the consistency and that the agreed settings contractually are the ones that are captured within the systems that are installed. Thank you for your patience, everyone. We're actually trying to glean more common themes. And I'm sure through the heavy analysis in the background to capture all of the questions, we may have missed something, so we'll make sure that we work through all of the questions after the call and with the ENA to confirm that everything has been captured. But outside of what we're viewing at the moment in terms of the collation of the questions, we feel we've had a good starting point at trying to respond, but then we'll actually do that review of the entire question set to ensure that we've got everything exhaustively covered. Might be a good idea at this point in time to bring up the slide with his email address as well, just so that there is a point of contact for everyone on the webinar. But Heath and Stuart, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tanika. Stuart, any words you want to add to finish up?
Oh, look, no, I'd just like to say thank you very much for everyone who's participating. I also, this is just part of the engagement, so it's to try and get this out there. So if people have got some questions or would like to go into some of the issues that have been raised within the presentation today, feel free to either contact Heath, myself, to talk through that, and we'll be very happy to make sure that we're actually covering all the different issues, or we can allay issues or fears, or what our next steps and processes are going to be around this. So we're very happy to go through that, and just really want to iterate that we want to have that continuing engagement too. So once these are out, it's getting feedback on them to what's working, what's not working, so we can actually look at in future iterations of these. And secondly, we'd love your engagement further in terms of the new other guidelines we'll be developing in the first part of next year.
All right, excellent. Well, we still have about 40 people dialed in, so that's going okay. Thanks everyone for questions. we're noting all the questions down. My email address is there should you wish to ask questions like Stuart said, or perhaps get a copy of the draft guidelines as they stand. These points in the slides are, I should say, clarified based on the final draft version. The final version may have slight differences based on input, and you should expect that to be made available after Christmas, I suggest. Thanks, everyone. We might close up there. And
I was just going to say that the presentation will be put up onto our website as well. So if people want to see this or get access to the presentation, we'll be putting it up on the Energy Networks Australia website probably in the next couple of days.
Yes, I've got to mention that. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.